Dr. Joseph Loconte is an associate professor of history at the King's College in New York City, where he teaches courses on Western civilization, American foreign policy, and international human rights. He is the author of the New York Times bestseller, A Hobbit, A Wardrobe, and A Great War: How J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis rediscovered faith, friendship, and heroism in the cataclysm of 1914 to 1918, in which he explores the works of Tolkien and Lewis in light of the spiritual crisis sparked by the conflict of the First World War. He is also the winner of the 2017 Best Article Award from the Tolkien Society for his article, How J.R.R. Tolkien Found Mordor on the Western Front. He is at work on a documentary film series based on the book, and a trailer for it can be viewed at hobbitwardrobe.com if you guys are interested. Dr. Loconte's commentary on religion and public life has appeared in the nation's leading media outlets, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the National Public Radio, the National Interest, the Weekly Standard, and National Review, to name a few. His other books include God, Locke, and Liberty: The Struggle for Religious Freedom in the West, The Searchers: A Quest for Faith in the Valley of Doubt, and Religious Leaders Confront Hitler's Gathering Storm. Dr. Loconte has testified before Congress on religious freedom and international human rights and was a member of the Congressional Task Force on UN Reform. He served as a distinguished visiting professor at the School of Public Policy at Pepperdine and as a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C. From 1999 to 2006, Dr. Loconte held the first chair in Religion and Civil Society as the William E. Simon Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Currently, he is a senior fellow at the Trinity Forum in Washington, D.C., and a scholar advisor at the Faith and Liberty Discovery Center in Philadelphia. Dr. Loconte has a master's degree in Christian history and theology from Wheaton College and earned his PhD in history at King's College London. A native of Brooklyn, New York, he divides his time between New York and DC. So, I welcome you, please.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And I think we're going to have someone minding our little slideshow over here in a moment. I can't tell you how thrilled I am to be here for this inaugural event with the rebranding here, the Philadelphia Commons Institute. Leah, thank you so much for that introduction. You got me sobbing over here, my friend. I've known Leah for many, many years, and I can tell you, no scholar working at a think tank could have a more intelligent, enthusiastic, warm-hearted research assistant than Leah Howard. So let's have a round of applause for Leah, what she's done over here. And also, let's talk about this Italian menu just for a moment. The Italian food, I have to say, I love my Anglo-Saxon friends, but let's get some Italian food. How about a round of applause for the caterers tonight? Just delicious stuff. And because Leah and I have kind of a mutual admiration society, I know she's really talked up this talk. I mean, she's ramped it up, and I want to kind of manage the expectations a little bit. A quick little story. I was in Naples, Italy, several years ago, and Naples is a beautiful Bay of Naples and all, but it can be a little bit like Baltimore. It's kind of the Baltimore of southern Italy in some parts of town and all, brother. And there I am. I lose my passport in Naples. And poor Joe lost in Naples, without his passport. And so I'm knocking around, and there is a election campaign going on in Naples, Italy. And there's a farcical candidate there who's got his face plastered all over the city of Naples. And he looks like kind of a young Groucho Marx. He's clearly a farcical candidate. He has a one-line slogan for his campaign. Here's his slogan. Non fare niente, ma la farò molto bene. I will do nothing, but I will do it very well. So that's all we're going to do here tonight. But another word, if I could, on the Philadelphia Commons Institute and how proud I am to be associated here with this event. I come from Washington, D.C. now. I was born in New York, and I've been living in Washington for 20 years. And I brought my swampy weather with me here from the swamp. And I do have some good tidings from the swamp, I think, tonight. But we can either, in these last few weeks, as we've kind of all endured the last few weeks in our country politically, we can either go further into a ditch, further into a swamp, or we can kind of pull ourselves out. And I can't think of an organization better positioned and primed to help us pull ourselves out than this organization here, the Philadelphia Commons Institute. So please give generously as you can. So with that said, let's get into it. I'll talk for about 30 minutes or so. We'll try to be as succinct as possible, and we'll give you an overview of some things. 7 a.m., July 1st, 1916, and the British Army unleashes what can only be called a hellish assault against German positions on the Western Front in France along the River Somme. The roar of the guns is so loud it is heard in London, 200 miles away. And this barrage, about 3,500 shells a minute, is designed to obliterate the deepest dugouts, compromise the German artillery, the machine gun power, crossing no man's land, that dreadful death zone stretching between the opposing enemy trenches is going to be a song, the soldiers are told. And so at 7:30 a.m., on the opening day of the Battle of the Somme, about 100,000 British troops, to the sound of whistles, drums, bagpipes, climb out of their trenches and attack. Well, like other great battles, this one was supposed to break the back of the German army and hasten the end of the war. But the Germans have endured the pounding, and they're waiting, guns poised, for the British infantry. "We didn't have to aim," said a German machine gunner. "We just fired into them." Before the day is over, 19,420 British soldiers lay dead. You heard the number right. 19,420 are dead, twice that number wounded, most killed in the first hour of the attack, many within the first minutes. So July 1st, 1916, is the deadliest single day in British military history. And that's a lot of military history, right? Sir Frank Fox, the regimental historian, he put it this way: "In that field of fire, nothing could live." The Battle of the Somme, typical of the battles fought during the First World War, will rage on inconclusively for months, dragging over 1 million men into its vortex of suffering and death. 24-year-old J.R.R. Tolkien, a second lieutenant in the British Expeditionary Force, is among their number. Tolkien spent several months in the trenches in the Somme Valley, often under intense enemy fire. In the midst of war, with the threat of death all about him, it is here, Tolkien explained, that he began writing the early parts of his mythology about Middle-earth, at lectures in cold fogs, he says, or by candlelight in bell tents, even some down in dugouts under shell fire. It is here that he writes the story of the fall of Gondolin, the tale of how the elven city of Gondolin is betrayed into the hands of Morgoth. Tolkien called this the first real story of his imaginary world, Middle-earth, and he's writing it now. He's writing it here. He's laying the foundation for his great epic work. Well, while Tolkien is enduring the horror of the trenches, another young man with a gift for storytelling is hoping he can avoid the conflict altogether. Clive Staples Lewis is standing on a train station platform at the Great Bookham train station in March of 1916. He's trying to put the war out of his mind. He's not yet 18, but C.S. Lewis knows his deployment to the front is inevitable. Lewis has been studying the classics under a tutor before applying to Oxford, and he's reaching for authors now who can nourish a growing taste for fantasy and romance: William Morris, John Keats, Percy Shelley. Lewis walks over to a bookstall at the station platform and buys a copy of Phantastes, a mythic romance by the Scottish Christian author George MacDonald. And as he absorbs the book during his train ride, Lewis senses in this work a hopeful, spiritual quality that he has encountered almost nowhere else. Here's a few lines from Phantastes that he must have read on the train. "Soon I fell asleep, overcome with fatigue and delight, in dreams of unspeakable joy, of restored friendships, of revived embraces, of love which said it had never died, of faces that had vanished long ago, yet said with smiling lips they knew nothing of the grave, of pardons implored and granted, with such bursting floods of love, I was almost glad I had sinned. Thus I passed through this wondrous twilight, and I awoke with the feeling that I'd been kissed and loved to my heart's content. Lewis explained the effect on him. A few hours later, he said, I knew that I'd crossed a great frontier. Reaching unexpectedly into his imagination, MacDonald's book challenges Lewis's deepening atheism. Ultimately, it's going to help to make plausible the Christian account of the human predicament. That's coming. Like Tolkien, Lewis finds himself in a combat regiment on the Western Front. He arrives in France as a second lieutenant, November 1917, on his 19th birthday. Any 19-year-olds out here? 19-year-olds. Happy birthday to you on the Western Front. Terrific. 19. 5 months at the front, and C.S. Lewis has had enough of war. Here's how he put it. The frights, the cold, the smell of high explosive, the horribly smashed men still moving like half-crushed beetles. Well, both men survived the First World War. Both survive. Tolkien contracts trench fever, sent home to a hospital in England to recover. Lewis is severely injured in a mortar attack that kills his sergeant, who's standing nearby. He's sent to a hospital in London to recover from his wounds. And the two men meet for the first time at Oxford, 1926, both as instructors of English literature. And almost immediately now, a bond of friendship is established that is going to transform their lives and their literary careers. They will use their personal experience of combat to inform their Christian imagination. They will enlist the hardships of war as a crucible for moral and spiritual growth. Together, Tolkien and Lewis will retrieve the concept of the epic and mythic hero and reinvent him for the modern mind. Tolkien creates, of course, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, one of the best-selling novels ever written, among the most influential books of the 20th century. Lewis earns fame for books such as Mere Christianity, The Screwtape Letters, The Chronicles of Narnia, this series of children's books that has sold over 100 million copies, ranked among the classics. Not bad, right? Well, it could be argued that these tales of conflict, this conflict between light and darkness, would never have been written had these two authors not been flung into the furnace of combat themselves. Their shared experience of the sorrows and the triumphs of war helps to bring them together in friendship. And their common moral vision, their lifelong collaboration, makes possible their great creative works: war, friendship, and imagination. War, friendship, and imagination. That's the big picture. Now let's try to unpack it a bit. Let's unpack it. I don't think we can fully appreciate the achievement of Tolkien and Lewis unless we understand their historical context. The kind of stuff we historians love to do. We'll give you the context, whether you want it or not, we're going to give it to you. The catastrophic effects of the First World War on world civilization, the crisis of the West. And a month from now, November 11th, 2018, we're going to mark the centennial of the end of the First World War. 4 years of mechanized slaughter. Roughly 20 million people dead, soldiers and civilians, another 21 million wounded. Before it's all over, friends, nearly every family in Europe is grieving the loss of a family member, or helping others to grieve, or caring for a wounded soldier, struggling to adjust to civilian life. Listen to Winston Churchill on this. All the horrors of all the ages were brought together, he says, and not only armies, but whole populations were thrust into the midst of them. National economies are ruined, entire empires have collapsed. The war to make the world safe for democracy has left the European democracies in tatters. Like no other force in history, the First World War damages the mental and the moral outlook of European society. It instigates a season of cynicism and agnosticism toward the ideals and the institutions of Western civilization. The disillusionment of the post-war generation, and that's kind of the watchword now, disillusionment. That disillusionment finds an outlet in literature, in the arts, in philosophy, science, and politics. Just consider here, ladies and gentlemen, some of the book titles published in the years after the conflict, 1920s, 1930s. I've got a lot of these books on my shelf at home. The End of the World, 1920. Social Decay and Degeneration, 1921. Spengler's The Decline of the West, 1922. The Decay of Capitalist Civilization, 1923. The Twilight of the White Races, 1926. Will Civilization Crash, 1927. The Problem of Decadence, 1931. And W.H. Auden's, one of my personal favorites, The Dance of Death, 1933. How's that for a Loconte Book of the Month Club? Come on over, The Dance of Death. Free coffee and donuts. You get a sense of what's happening in the 20s and the 30s, the mood. Well, the war, the aftermath, it's creating a kind of spiritual crisis, a malaise. To many of the best and brightest, Christianity lacks any explanatory power. It cannot answer for its own role in the remorseless violence unleashed by the supposedly Christian nations of Europe. The Bible seems to offer no realistic hope of achieving a more just global order, so there's a new skepticism in the air. One little example. T.S. Eliot is baptized into the Church of England in 1927 as a conversion to Catholic Christianity. And when that happens, Virginia Woolf, a member of London's literary set, the set that T.S. Eliot had been running in, she's appalled at his conversion. Appalled. Here's what she writes to a friend. I have had a most shameful and distressing interview with dear Tom Eliot, who may be called dead to us all from this day forward, she says. I mean, there's something obscene in a living person sitting by the fire and believing in God. Well, nature abhors a vacuum. The Great War seems to confirm the fatal weaknesses of liberal democracy and biblical religion. And so the door is just thrust open to all kinds of substitute faiths. Let's take eugenics. Eugenics. One of the most striking effects of the war is an acute anxiety, especially in educated circles, that something is profoundly wrong with the racial stock of Western civilization, a kind of sickness in the racial body. And so the promotion of eugenics, from the Latin phrase good birth, that had begun in Great Britain before the war, but now it's taken off. Sir Francis Galton, the British sociologist who coined the term, he put it this way, Francis Galton, eugenics must be introduced into the national conscience like a new religion. It has strong claims to become an orthodox religious tenet of the future because eugenics cooperates with the workings of nature by ensuring that humanity shall be represented by the fittest races. What nature does blindly, slowly, ruthlessly, he says, man may do providently, quickly, and kindly. Well, eugenics will gain international support and scientific respectability in that period between the wars, just as Tolkien and Lewis are establishing their academic careers. And remember, the aim of that movement, the eugenics movement, use the tools of science and public policy to improve the human gene pool through what? Immigration laws, marriage laws, birth control, and forced sterilization. Forced sterilization. Benito Mussolini, who sweeps into power in Italy in 1922, he is the first European leader to exploit the language of eugenics to establish his fascist regime. Science and government will work together to improve the Italian race. That's the idea. And I should just say, my maternal grandfather, Giuseppe Aiello, for whom I'm named, he left his island home of Ventotene off the coast of Naples. He left it in 1921. A year before Mussolini took office. I just want to say to Grandpa, molto grazie mio nonno, bravo. Nice work, Grandpa, well done. And, well, Nazism, one of Mussolini's earliest advisors, of course, is Adolf Hitler. Nazism, according to Hitler's deputy, Rudolf Hess, was, quote, applied biology. Hitler's Aryan race was the eugenic ideal, and maintaining its purity became the focus of his national policy. So, fascism, Nazism, communism, scientism, eugenics. These are the revolutions and the ideologies that are sweeping the European continent in the 1920s and 30s in the exhaustion of the Western democracies because of the war. All of them have a vision. It's a vision, friends, for perfecting human nature. All of them launch an assault on nature itself. All begin by promising liberation from oppression. All become instruments of totalitarian control. And this makes the literary aims of Tolkien and Lewis profoundly countercultural, even subversive. That's the context. These guys are going to vigorously reject these utopian, totalitarian visions. And that rejection, their rejection, it's on display, I believe, in how each of their stories elevates what? The individual. The individual responsibility in response to a great crisis. Remember, again, the First World War, like no other war, it assaulted the individual. It degraded the belief in individual virtue, valor, heroism. Think about it. The helplessness of the individual soldier, ravaged by the tools of modern industrial societies, is a recurring theme in the post-war period. The blockbuster novel All Quiet on the Western Front, Eric Remarque, he predicts a generation of war veterans broken, burnt out, rootless, and without hope. The modern literary critic Roger Sale has called the First World War the single event most responsible for shaping the modern idea that heroism is dead. Let me read that one again. The First World War as the single event most responsible for shaping the modern idea that heroism is dead. Tolkien and Lewis openly rebel against this outlook. They reject it. The key to understanding the moral universe of Narnia and Middle-earth and the role of the individual in that universe can be found in a scene from The Lord of the Rings. We see it in Aragorn's answer to Eomer, who asks how they ought to respond to the storm of evil thrust upon them. Good and evil have not changed since yesteryear, nor are they one thing among elves and dwarves and another among men. It is a man's part to discern them. A universal moral law to which everyone is accountable. That's what he's saying, right? The same vision animates the Chronicles of Narnia. All of the various creatures, including the bears and the badgers, the moles and the mice, along with the English children, they're all summoned to help rescue Narnia from a new despotism, right? And restore its rightful line of kings. I'd rather be killed fighting for Narnia, says Jill, than grow old and stupid at home and perhaps go about in a bath chair and then die in the end just the same. In Narnia and Middle-earth, every person is caught up in this great moral contest. And the choices of every person in this contest matter, and they matter supremely. Let me underscore the point. Remember what the soldiers of the Western Front were made to endure. The mortars, the machine guns, the tanks, the poison gas, the flamethrowers, the barbed wire, the trench warfare. Never before had technology and science so conspired to obliterate both man and nature. On average, about 6,046 men were killed every day of the war. Every day, for the length of the war. The mutilated remains of millions of men were consigned to graves scattered across Europe. And for what? They asked. What difference did individuals make in the face of that, they asked. That's the mood. Tolkien and Lewis reject this attitude. In the worlds they create, everyone has a role to play in this epic battle between light and darkness, and the moral and spiritual growth of their characters, it depends on their individual choices, right? Such is the course of deeds that move the wheels of the world, Tolkien writes. Small hands do them because they must, while the eyes of the great are elsewhere. In Lewis's The Chronicles of Narnia, we follow the adventures, of course, of the Pevensie children as they become part of a great war for the kingdom of Narnia against the White Witch and the forces of evil. Remember Lucy in Prince Caspian? You know, there's that moment of crisis in that story when the outcome of the war is hanging in the balance. And this little girl is asked to do something that's difficult for her, something that could be costly, something she doesn't want to do. She has to decide if she'll put away her fears and obey Aslan. I mustn't think about it. I must just do it. She could feel lion strength going into her. Now you are a lioness, Aslan said, and now all Narnia will be renewed. Remember that scene in The Horse and His Boy? Shasta and Aravis, helped by the talking horses, they race across the desert to warn Narnia of the approaching army of Rabadash, bent on its destruction. And before reaching the goal, they're attacked by a lion. Aravis, further behind, is moments from being cut down. Shasta now has a choice to make. Stop, bellowed Shasta in Bree's ear. Must go back. Must help. Shasta slipped his feet out of the stirrups, slid both his legs over the left side, hesitated for one hideous hundredth of a second, and jumped. It hurt horribly and nearly winded him, but before he knew how it hurt him, he was staggering back to help Aravis. Ladies and gentlemen, scenes like that would be very familiar to many veterans of the Great War. The image of a soldier throwing himself into harm's way to rescue a fallen comrade. Well, in the conflict between the White Witch and Narnia, between Mordor and Middle-earth, every soul is tested. Every creature must choose sides. Moral indifference is not an option. And under this vision, heroic sacrifice for a just cause, even against terrible odds, it carries its own transcendent meaning. The vital thing is to remain faithful to the quest, regardless of the costs and the perils. Well, in The Lord of the Rings, Frodo. In The Lord of the Rings, the mission of Frodo Baggins is to carry the Ring of Power, of course, to the fires of Mount Doom and to destroy it before it can destroy him and all of Middle-earth. I am not made for perilous quests, Frodo exclaims. Why was I chosen? You may be sure that it was not for any merit that others do not possess, says Gandalf. Not for power or wisdom at any rate, but you have been chosen, and you must therefore use such strength and heart and wits as you have. Here again, I think, Tolkien's experience at the Somme works on his imagination. Where did Tolkien get the idea for his hobbits in the first place? After he became a professor at Oxford University, while he's sitting and grading student papers. Got some teachers in the room over here, just out of curiosity. Raise your hand if you're teachers out there, okay? And how many of you teachers, how many of you really enjoy grading student papers? Enjoy it. You're lying back there in the back room, you're lying. No. Nobody likes grading papers, we understand that. Well, he found a blank sheet. And he scrawls on the blank sheet these words. In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. Later on, Tolkien reflects, eventually, I thought I'd better find out what hobbits are like. Well, we know what hobbits are like, right? Listen to Tolkien on this. I have always been impressed that we're here, surviving, because of the indomitable courage of quite small people against impossible odds, he says. The hobbits were made small, he explained, to show up in creatures of very small physical power, the amazing and unexpected heroism of ordinary men at a pinch, he says. What's he talking about? He's talking about the men that he fought alongside in the trenches in France. They were not, for the most part, a professional army. They were citizen soldiers, shopkeepers, bartenders, doctors, farmers, fishermen. Listen to Tolkien. My Sam Gamgee is indeed a reflection of the English soldier, of the privates that I knew in the 1914 war and recognized as so far superior to myself. Well, one of the most beloved characters in fiction is based on the ordinary English soldier at his post, doing his duty regardless of the cost. This is part of the raw material for much of their moral imagination. It's part of it. The value of every person, even the weakest and the smallest. Now let's add a second element. Born again out of their own historical experience. The Nietzschean will to power. Who's read Nietzsche out there? You have my sympathies, you Nietzsche readers, all right? Will to Power. The rise of the totalitarian state. It is no accident, friends, that both of these men composed their epic stories under the shadow of a Second World War. Remember the opening lines of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe? Once there were 4 children whose names were Peter, Susan, Edmund, Lucy. The story is about something that happened to them when they were sent away from London during the war because of the air raids. They were sent to the house of an old professor who lived in the heart of the country. Think about it. The children, they leave one world which is being torn apart by a vicious war, only to enter another world being torn apart by war. C.S. Lewis's life is framed by war. He shared his Oxford home with his older brother Warren, also a combat veteran, both bachelors for a long time. They opened up their home to English refugee children throughout the Second World War. July 21st, 1940, during a sermon at a church service at Holy Trinity Church in Oxford, where Lewis would worship. And I've been to that church, been in the pew where he would worship. Lewis begins thinking, 1940, he begins thinking about the Prince of Darkness. He's in church. Why? Maybe because at that very moment, Britain is at war with Hitler's Germany. Maybe because Lewis had listened to one of Hitler's speeches broadcast and translated on the BBC the previous Friday, just a couple of days before. And what did he hear? He heard a man hell-bent on the subjugation and dehumanization of other races, determined to dominate not only his own nation, but an entire continent. Here was the will to power, unconstrained by law, custom, or conscience. Here is a man waging a war against civilization itself. So the idea for a book comes into his mind. A book made up of the secret correspondence between 2 demons, a work that exposes the strategies of the devil to draw us into his diabolical net. It'll be known, of course, as the Screwtape Letters, now considered a masterpiece of modern satire. And it's conceived by a man in church at his prayers under the shadow of another great war. Well, it is also no coincidence, I believe, that J.R.R. Tolkien began writing The Lord of the Rings in 1937, continued working on it throughout the Second World War, just as fascist ideologies are dominating international politics. Our friend Mussolini has invaded Ethiopia in 1936, bringing his fascist policies with him. And I should say again, parenthetically, my paternal grandfather, Michael Loconte, living in the United States, got my grandmother and my father and his brother Vito. Yeah, there's a few Uncle Vitos in my family, by the way. And they get him out of Italy in 1935. Nice timing, Grandpa. Bravo. Thank you again for that. Just in time. 1937. What else is going on? Hitler tears up the Versailles Treaty. Mussolini pulls out of the League of Nations. 1938. Germany absorbs Austria, orchestrates the Munich Agreement, that act of appeasement which allows Hitler to take over the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia in exchange for a promise of peace. In the same year, 1938, Jews across Germany are violently assaulted during Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. So the logic of eugenics and its link to the totalitarian state. Although Tolkien denied that his work was allegorical, he always denied that, he did acknowledge in a 1938 letter, and I was thrilled when I found this, 1938 letter to his publisher, that his new story, quote, was becoming more terrifying than The Hobbit. The darkness of the present days has had some effect on it. Well, one of the narrative threads, it seems to me, of The Lord of the Rings, it can be read as a conscious assault on the entire racist totalitarian project. The seductive desire for power, the desire to dominate others, if you think about it, it's a recurring theme, isn't it? Virtually no character in their stories, Tolkien or Lewis, is immune to the temptation. We see it, for example, with Edmund in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. He becomes a pawn to the White Witch. Studio audience, why does Edmund become a pawn to the White Witch? What's that? Turkish delight. We have Turkish delight for dessert tonight, just out of curiosity? All right. Right on, man. Turkish delight. And not just that, the desire to dominate his siblings. That's the other thing he wants, to lord it over them. In Prince Caspian, Nickabrick, initially a foot soldier in the fight for Narnia, turns traitor when Aslan, the lion, fails to come to their aid when they call him. Nickabrick makes the appalling suggestion that his comrade should enlist the help of the White Witch. We want power, he says, and we want a power that will be on our side. In Tolkien's story, we learn that Saruman, the wizard originally committed to helping Middle-earth in the struggle against Mordor, has fallen under the sway of the Ring of Power. Prudence, he argues, demands a temporary compromise with Sauron, the Dark Lord. We can bide our time, he says. We can keep our thoughts in our hearts, deploring maybe evils done by the way, he says, but approving the high and ultimate purpose. Sounds a little bit like my town in Washington, D.C., doesn't it? Just a little bit like it sometimes. But even a more noble character, such as Boromir, he falls prey to the temptation, doesn't he? He disagrees with the decision at the Council of Elrond to destroy the ring, and he confronts Frodo as he begins his quest. True-hearted men will not be corrupted, he assures Frodo. We do not desire the power of wizard lords, only strength to defend ourselves, strength and a just cause. By turning on Frodo and forcing him to flee, Boromir breaks the fellowship, and he endangers them all. Well, Tolkien and Lewis are often accused of escapism. Escapism. Is this escapism? I think these are naked facts about the human condition. The Lord of the Rings was published in the early 1950s, and because of that, during the atomic age now, we've got the atomic weapons. Many people assume that the story of the ring was an allegorical warning about the horror of nuclear weapons. Tolkien sets them straight. He says, of course my story is not an allegory of atomic power, but of power exerted for domination. That's what he says his story is about. Power exerted for domination. Is this escapism? Bitter and brutal realism, it seems to me, about our mortal lives. So, Tolkien and Lewis, they share this fundamental moral vision, right? The idea that the choices of every person truly matter, that the lust for power is a permanent feature of human life, and that we must do battle against it. Now let's add another element to the story. How do we do battle against the will to power? How? Tolkien and Lewis proclaim that the vital importance of friendship in our common struggle against evil. This is the key. Our common struggle in friendship against evil. Their personal knowledge of the fellowship of men under fire, this has to rank as another defining experience for their literary lives. Both of these men formed some of their most important friendships under the shadow of war. For C.S. Lewis, one of those friendships was a guy named Lawrence Johnson, 20-year-old recruit he met at Oxford and then fought alongside in a regiment in France. They have a shared love for literature and philosophy. They both enjoy debating the big questions about God and morality, and they're thrust into combat together, and even there, they find time to talk, to debate during the lulls in the fighting. So like C.S. Lewis, the bombs stop flying for a moment, and he's arguing theology with his friend Lawrence Johnson. He called Johnson a man of conscience, a man with a moral code who caused him to rethink his atheism, his materialism. Here's how Lewis put it. I had hardly till now encountered principles in anyone so nearly my own age and my own sort. The alarming thing was he took these principles for granted. Reflecting years later, Tolkien declared that Johnson, quote, would have been a lifelong friend if he'd not been killed. He was moving toward theism, and we had endless arguments on that and every other topic whenever we were out of the line, he says. The hound of heaven is chasing Lewis, it seems to me. He lost nearly all of his closest friends in the First World War. Nightmares of the conflict, he said, invaded my dreams for years. And yet this theme of friendship, it pulses through each of the Narnia stories, doesn't it? It's like a force of nature. It might even be said that friendship replaces romance as the preeminent expression of love in Lewis's stories, right? It flourishes among the children, between the children and the noble Narnians, between Aslan and all who serve him in love and obedience. And it's the same for Tolkien. devoted to his inner circle of friends from the King Edward School there in Birmingham in England. Christopher Wiseman, Jeffrey Smith, Robert Gilson. They were a band of brothers, these young men. They all enlisted for combat at about the same time. And in 1916, just before being sent into the theater of war, they all gather at Wiseman's flat in London. And they talk late into the night. And they share their hopes and their dreams for the future. It was during this time, among these men, that Tolkien says he began to get a sense of his life's calling. And like Lewis, most of Tolkien's friends perished in the fighting along the Western Front. Rob Gilson, a member of that inner circle, he died on the opening day of the Battle of the Somme, July 1st, 1916. He bravely led his regiment in a doomed assault on a German dugout. Tolkien felt the loss deeply when he got the news, and he wrote to his other friend, Jeffrey Smith. He says, "I don't know what is to be our next move or what is in store. I wish I could know where you are." It brings to my mind a scene in The Lord of the Rings when Merry, remember Merry? He finds himself cut off from his companions and he's facing great danger. Remember how Tolkien puts it? Everyone he cared for had gone away into the gloom that hung over the distant eastern sky, and little hope at all was left in his heart that he would ever see any of them again. Is it surprising? Is it surprising that the cords of friendship amid the suffering of war is one of the great themes of The Lord of the Rings? Frodo and his company make up, of course, the fellowship of the ring. The fellowship. When Frodo arrives at Crick Hollow, before setting out into the Old Forest, he's determined to leave on his own, right? He doesn't want to expose his companions to the perils that lie ahead. But Merry, Pippin, and Sam, well, they're on to his plans. And they confront him before he can slip away. They insist on coming with him. Frodo, deeply moved, nevertheless protests. "But it does not seem that I can trust anyone." Merry is unflappable. "It all depends on what you want. You can trust us to stick to you through thick and thin to the bitter end. And you can trust us to keep any secret of yours closer than you keep it yourself. But you cannot trust us to let you face trouble alone and go off without a word. We're your friends, Frodo. We know a good deal about the ring. We are horribly afraid, but we're coming with you or following you like hounds." We all need a few people like that walking with us through life, following us like hounds. Well, the friendship between Sam and Frodo, it's one of the moral triumphs of the story, isn't it? Remember when they're at the threshold of Mount Doom, near the very end of their quest. They're weak from thirst and exhaustion. They're nearly overwhelmed by the desolation of the landscape, the lack of another living thing, the black skies, the noxious fumes, the ash and the slag and the burned stone and the smell of death. As Tolkien himself admitted, in his mind, it resembled the landscape of the battlefields in France. They staggered toward their goal. Frodo, weakened by the great burden of carrying the ring, begins to crawl on his hands. Sam looked at him and wept in his heart, but no tears came to his dry and stinging eyes. "I said I'd carry him if it broke my back," he muttered, "and I will. Come, Mr. Frodo," he cried. "I can't carry it for you, but I can carry you and it as well. Come on, Mr. Frodo, dear. Sam will give you a ride. Just tell him where to go, and he'll go." I think it's a pretty good bet that only men who knew friendship of this kind, who experienced it in the field of combat, could write passages of such grit and courage and nobility. Caught up in youth in the catastrophe of war, Tolkien and Lewis could never forget the war's sorrows, but neither do they succumb to its despair. And I think the friendship that they deliberately pursued with one another is a huge part of the reason, because out of that friendship came something profoundly creative and ennobling. "Most gracious host, it was said to me by Elrond half-elven that I should find friendship upon the way, secret and unlooked for," Frodo explains to Faramir. "Certainly I have looked for no such friendship as you have shown. To have found it turns evil to great good." Well, after the war, Tolkien and Lewis, they will seek to recapture something like the intense comradeship that sustained them during those crisis years of 1914, 1918. And so at Oxford, they launched the Inklings, those who dabble in ink, the group of friends and fellow scholars, most of them Christians, who meet weekly to read and discuss their work. They gather every Tuesday. Oops. Miss one? No? Just stop. Leave it right there. Leave it right there. That's fine. They gather every Tuesday at the Eagle and Child pub. And then every Thursday evening in Lewis's rooms at Magdalen College. They will meet for the better part of 20 years every week. It's this community of friends that Lewis must have in mind when he writes those unforgettable words in his book, The Four Loves. Let me read you a few lines from the Four Loves on friendship. In friendship, we think we've chosen our peers. In reality, a few years difference in the dates of our births, a few more miles between certain houses, the choice of one university instead of another, the posting to different regiments, any of these chances might have kept us apart. And then he goes on, but for a Christian, there are, strictly speaking, no chances. A secret master of the ceremonies has been at work. Christ, who said to the disciples, "Ye have not chosen me, but I've chosen you," can truly say to every group of friends, Christian friends, "You have not chosen one another, but I have chosen you for one another." We may suspect, ladies and gentlemen, that Providence had a hand in bringing these two men together in friendship, because the debt that they owe to each other is incalculable. It's Tolkien's conversation with C.S. Lewis on the night of September 19th, 1931. We know this from one of Lewis's letters. September 19th, 1931, Tolkien and Lewis talk until 3 o'clock in the morning about the nature of myths and about Christianity as a true myth. It's that conversation that Lewis describes as the immediate human cause of his conversion to Christianity. Tolkien opened up a door for him, an intellectual door. For his part, Lewis becomes for Tolkien his great advocate for pursuing his hobbitry, as they called it. His hobbitry. This is how Tolkien put it. It was Lewis's gift to him. His gift was his sheer encouragement to him over many years to keep on with writing the manuscript, which took over a dozen years. Listen to Tolkien. He, Lewis, was for long my only audience. Only from him did I ever get the idea that my stuff could be more than a private hobby. But for his interest and unceasing eagerness for more, I should never have brought The Lord of the Rings to a conclusion. When Lewis learns that The Lord of the Rings has been accepted for publication, he gets the news, he writes a letter to Tolkien, describing his sheer pleasure of looking forward to having the book now to read over and over. And then he reveals the importance of the book, The Lord of the Rings, to both their lives. And when I found this letter, it just made the hair stand up on my neck. What the book means to both their lives. Here's what he said. Lewis to Tolkien. So much of your whole life, so much of our joint life, so much of the war, so much that seemed to be slipping away into the past is now in a sort made permanent. Do you grasp what he's saying? Somehow, Tolkien has captured something of their life's journey together with all of its struggles and all of its joys, and it's hidden in the pages of this great work. Here is a glimpse of what friendship can look like when it reaches for a high purpose and it's watered by the streams of sacrifice and loyalty and love. Well, the last soldier to die in the Great War was an American, 23-year-old Henry Gunther, a private with the American Expeditionary Force in France. He's killed at 10:59 a.m., November 11th, 1918, 1 minute before the armistice went into effect. Gunther's squad had encountered a roadblock of German machine guns near the village of Chaumont-d'Avillé. And against the orders of his sergeant, he charges the guns with his bayonet. German soldiers, aware of the armistice, try to wave him off. But Gunther kept coming, and he's gunned down, and he dies instantly. His divisional record states this: almost as he fell, the gunfire died away, and an appalling silence prevailed. Well, despite the celebrations and the parties and the parades marking the end of the First World War, a brutal and appalling silence fell over much of the world. It was the stillness of souls, anguished and bewildered by the carnage of the most destructive war the world had ever seen. Historian Paul Johnson has called the conflict, quote, the primal tragedy of modern world civilization, the main reason why the 20th century turned into such a disastrous epic for mankind. Winston Churchill, who fought in the war, described it this way: injuries were wrought to the structure of human society which a century will not efface, and which may conceivably prove fatal to the present civilization. Well, J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis lived through this disastrous epic. They endured its many injuries. Their lives are bracketed by war. Were they simply trying to escape the grim realities of the 20th century through their work? It's true that these authors clothe their stories in fantasy and myth. That's true. But they do this, I think, in order to remind us of certain facts about ourselves, the darkness of human nature, as well as our capacity for virtue and selfless sacrifice. Narnia and Middle-earth are the setting for great conflicts and great quests. Here are war stories, friends, wrapped in fantasy, which reveal ancient truths about the human condition. Tolkien and Lewis use the language of myth not to escape the world, but to suggest that real life has a mythic and heroic quality. And so their characters, they make a claim on us, don't they? They challenge us to join with them in the struggle against evil. What Lewis wrote in his review of Tolkien's story applies, I think, equally to his own work. Here's what he wrote: as we read, we find ourselves sharing their burden. When we've finished, we return to our own life, not relaxed, but fortified. War, friendship, and imagination. And yet, friends, even this is not the whole of their achievement as we bring this to a close. This is not the whole of it. And this brings us perhaps to the most surprising element of their story. In the worlds created by Tolkien and Lewis, this struggle against darkness is possible only because there's a source of grace and goodness outside of ourselves. Grace and goodness outside of us. By the end of his quest, think about it. By the end of his quest, Frodo the Ring-Bearer has given up the thought of ultimate success or even survival. Hope fails. An end comes, he tells Sam. We have only a little time to wait now. We are lost in ruin and downfall, and there's no escape. At the climax of his journey, at the fires of Mount Doom, despite all of his courage and strength, Frodo fails in his quest. He fails. He chooses not to destroy the ring, but instead succumbs to its power, places it once again on his finger. Remember what he says? I do not choose now to do what I came to do. The ring is mine. And so the hero cannot by his own efforts prevail in this fight against evil. The forces arrayed against him, as well as the darkness within him, make victory impossible. The mythic dimension of their stories now reaches its zenith. Like the best fairy tales, they provide the consolation of the happy ending, the sudden joyous turn, as Tolkien put it, toward rescue and redemption. It's the reversal of a catastrophe, what Tolkien calls the eucatastrophe, this decisive act of grace which promises to overcome our guilt, restore what's been lost, and set things right. So Frodo's defeat, which is really our defeat, it's overturned by a power stronger than our weakness. Tolkien identifies this power as, quote, that one ever-present person who is never absent and never named. And so it is that Gollum, driven by his lust to dominate, Gollum bites off Frodo's finger that bears the ring, only to slip and plunge to his death into the fire. And so the ring is destroyed, yeah, but not by Frodo, not by the Fellowship. It's destroyed by a sudden and miraculous grace. In Lewis's Narnia, The crowning moment of grace occurs in the last battle, as King Tyrion, the children, and a faithful remnant of Narnians fight their way to the entrance of the stable, the last battle of the last king of Narnia. Spoiler alert, friends, spoiler alert. Going to give away the end here. Well, we are led to believe that inside the stable is certain death, the stronghold of an all-powerful evil. I feel in my bones, says Pagan, that we shall all, one by one, pass through that dark door before morning. I can think of 100 deaths I would rather have died. And as the company is forced inside its doors, all hope seems lost. And here again comes the joyous turn, because the great lion has invaded the stable, cast out the demon Tash, and turned the stable into a portal to Aslan's country. So, what do we have? These two giants of literature. There is only one truth, one singular event that can end the long war against evil, undo the tragedy of the human condition, and bring lasting peace: the return of the king. The return of the king. In Narnia, the king is Aslan, the great lion, the Christ figure. Only Aslan knows the way to that blessed realm that lies beyond the sea. The light ahead was growing stronger, writes Lewis in the last battle. Lucy saw that a great series of many-colored cliffs led up in front of them, like a giant staircase. And then she forgot everything else, because Aslan himself was coming, leaping down from cliff to cliff like a living cataract of power and beauty. This king comes in power and beauty, as the voice of conscience and the source of consolation, as the lion and the lamb. Here is the union of tenderness and severity, as Lewis put it, of terror and comfort intertwined. In Tolkien's story, this king is Aragorn. Aragorn, the chief epic hero of the Lord of the Rings. Heir to the kingship of Gondor, his life is devoted to the war against Sauron. His true stature is made known, however, only after Sauron's defeat, when he finally assumes his throne. Here's how Tolkien describes that moment. But when Aragorn arose, all that beheld him gazed in silence, for it seemed to them that he was revealed to them now for the first time. Tall as the sea kings of old, he stood above all that were near. Ancient of days he seemed, and yet in the flower of manhood. And wisdom sat upon his brow, and strength and healing were in his hands. And the light was about him. And then Faramir cried, "Behold the king!" Here is a vision of human life that is at once terrifying and sublime. Here is a world, our world, in which every soul is caught up in an epic struggle against evil. A story of sacrifice and courage and clashing armies. The return of the king. It is in these works of fiction, these mythic tales of loss and recovery, betrayal and redemption, that we find a clue to the meaning of our earthly journey. Is everything sad going to come untrue? Asks Sam. For the creators of Narnia and Middle-earth, this is the deepest source of hope for the human story. The belief that God and goodness are the ultimate realities, and that the shadow of sin and suffering will finally be lifted from our lives. The great war will be won, and this king, who brings strength and healing in his hands, will make everything sad come untrue. Thank you for listening. you. And I think we have a very short film trailer, about a 4.5 minute trailer. We're working on a little documentary film based on the book. We're still in production. We're still trying to raise money. Hint. And it'll give you a sense of things. I'm going to be with my film team, actually, in the UK and France from November 2nd to November 17th, doing some more filming. Great fun. Take it away.
Near the center of every great story is a great conflict, a great war. Two soldiers, each with a gift for storytelling, survive the storm and steel of the greatest war the world had ever seen. J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. Together, they used their imagination to battle the darkest forces of their age. A hobbit, a wardrobe, and a great war.
The generation of Tolkien and Lewis endured unspeakable loss in a war that they believed would advance the cause of humanity, the war to end all wars. Instead, the funeral of a great myth is about to begin.
And the rise of technology opens a window into the human heart. We are so clever. Look at all these wonderful scientific inventions we have. And what do we use them for? Destroying each other.
When war came, they thought it would be over very quickly. They had no idea that it would turn out to be the worst conflict up to that time in human history.
The tanks, the mortars, the machine guns. No soldier who fought in this war could ever forget the terrors of combat. Tolkien and Lewis will remember them well.
One gets a good sense, I think, from both authors, of the frightening quality of battle and the smallness the individual feels.
The essential thing that turned the modern world into what it is was the trauma of the First World War. And of course, both men were right at the heart of it.
And yet, out of the ashes of that conflict, a friendship emerged here, amid the dreaming spires of Oxford.
The friendship between Lewis and Tolkien is really one of the literary masterpieces of all time.
They simply didn't buy into the idea that there's an inevitable progression of humanity upwards into wider and greater knowledge, and that whatever is new is better and truer. They thought that was patently absurd.
How could they actually grapple with their experiences or come to terms with what they had seen? And they were using mythology as a way of doing that.
Tolkien and Lewis had a profound influence on each other. Remember, Lewis went into the war as an atheist, and he came out as an atheist. Without the presence of Tolkien in his life, he might never have shaken off his existential angst and produced works alive with the themes of faith, hope, and joy. For his part, Tolkien once admitted that were it not for Lewis's great encouragement, he never would have brought to a conclusion his epic trilogy. He needed Lewis's constant prodding and demands for more.
You know what Jack Lewis was like. He was such a boy. He had to have a story. And that story, The Lord of the Rings, was written to keep him quiet.
Imagine a world without The Lord of the Rings and without the Chronicles of Narnia. If it wasn't for the friendship between Lewis and Tolkien, we would have neither.
Lewis said, well, since children are going to grow up in a world of dragons and giants, let us at least show the children that dragons and giants can be overcome. The key character that emerges from Lord of the Rings is Samwise Gamgee. He is the hobbit that is just the normal person. He's a gardener. But at the end of the day, he achieves the final quest. And Tolkien sees him as the epitome of the average British soldier.
True heroism is hobbit-sized. It's in the everyday heroism of somebody who says, I don't know the way.
The hobbit is the small character who is sort of overlooked by all the great ones of the world, but it's on the hobbit's obedience and courage and endurance that Middle-earth is saved. Likewise, Lucy saves the day in Prince Caspian. So you don't have to be, the strong man. You don't have to be, armed to the teeth. You just need to do your duty.
Tolkien and Lewis are casting a vision for a better world and inviting us to be caught up in it.
They saw not an irrelevant other world in which you could escape, but curious enough, exactly the diagnostic tool that they needed to critique the world that they were in. And they did so to devastating effect.
They are fundamental texts. They're incredibly important introductions to some of the most profound questions that Western civilization has raised about the human condition. If we lose the ability to communicate the value of these books to the next generation, then I shall fear for our civilization.
Their great hope was to re-enchant the world through Christian faith and pagan beauty. In many ways, against all expectations, that's exactly what they did.
A hobbit, a wardrobe, and a great war.
Okay, yeah. Thanks for listening, guys. You can see the trailer at... You can see the trailer at hobbitwardrobe.com. Hobbitwardrobe.com. Thank you so much for helping.